So as we begin reflections today, it is the case, as many of you know, that Dick's immediate family predeceased him in death, but that in no way meant that he was not still deeply held in love and made a massive impact on people who are still here in this room and joining online. And so one of the first reflections that we have, that I'll begin reading the words of, is from his friend Bob Briggs. And Bob is tuning in online, but he meant to be here in person, but illness prevented him from being here with us in person today. But he sent me the words that he intended to read. So I will share those and do my best to do justice to some of these sweet anecdotes about Dick. And then we will have another person from our church, Maria, will come up next. And if there's any of you who would like to also share a memory of Dick, you are welcome as well. We'll take about another 10 minutes after these two reflections. So I begin with these words from Bob Briggs. And Bob, we feel you here online with us. He writes, "Illness prevents me from being with you in person today for the celebration of the life of Richard Hatch. Bob says we were best friends for 40 years, and I miss him. I first met Dick as a 30-year-old undergraduate student in his Introduction of Information Systems course at San Diego State. He was an awesome prof. I sat in the front row and aced every test. It wasn't that hard. Most of the students were still teenagers. I'd been running a business for 10 years and raising a family. Well, it turned out that the fellow sitting next to me aced every test as well. And so Dick was certain that we had devised this ingenious, evil way to cheat. Meanwhile, I was impressed at how well he trained his graduate assistants, because any time that I looked up during a test, there were at least 2 graduate students making eye contact with me. So that seemed impressive. In the end, Dick concluded we were legit. He became a mentor, and I owe a great deal of my professional success to his guidance. Sometime toward the end of my MBA work, he decided that we should be friends. It took him 2 years to persuade me to stop calling him Dr. Hatch. Dick told me that his parents really didn't know what to make of him when he was a boy. He took the Philco radio apart to figure out how it worked. He and his best friend, Roger Adcock, got hold of some fireworks and decided to see how high they could launch a trash can into the air. It turned out it was 20 feet. The explosion was so loud, people called the fire department, but he and Roger had long gone. Dick also told me that his parents finally bought the whole Encyclopedia Britannica for him, and he read it from A to Z. And then when I asked him what he did next, he said, "Well, I read it all again from A to Z." I mentioned to him that normal people don't do that. And he said, "I know." Bob also writes, "I have a passion for fine art. Anytime my research took me to anywhere near a great museum, I went. And I always told him about it. And he always teased me about it without mercy. He would say, 'Did you go to the Art Museum? Did you see some fine art?' And I just smiled. But after 20 years of teasing, he called me out of the blue and said without preamble, 'Bob, you are not a stupid man.' And I said, well, thank you, Dick." No reply. And I said, "Is there more to this?" And he said, "Well, I've been teasing you about art museums all these years, and you're still going. It occurs to me there might be more to it than I thought. You're going to the Netherlands next month. How about I come over when you're finished, and you take a week off and show me what you are on about?" So I took him to the Louvre, and he was skeptical. I promised we would power through it until he saw something interesting, but nothing at the Louvre interested him. The Winged Victory of Samothrace? No. The Venus de Milo? boring. The Romans, the medievals, the Renaissance, the Mannerists, nothing. Until the Rembrandts. There were 12 Rembrandt paintings, and we stayed with them until closing time. During that time, we figured out how Rembrandt could make a static face appear to be expressing 2 or 3 emotions simultaneously. Clever guy, that Rembrandt. I insisted that we must go see the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam the next day to see the great Dutch masters. He was pretty sure it wouldn't be interesting, but he put up with it. So we walked through the Dutch masters for a bit, and he stopped at a Rembrandt painting of Rembrandt's son dressed as a monk. I started to talk about it, and Dick disappeared. Gone. I thought, well, perhaps he's had enough of Rembrandt, and I wandered off as well. About half an hour later, he was back at the Rembrandt. I wandered over and started to point out things about the painting. He disappeared again. I found him again about an hour later as the exhibition was closing, and he didn't speak until we were about a block away from the museum. And then he said, "So explain something to me. How can some paint on a board make me cry?" And I asked, "What do you mean?" He said, "Every time I looked at Rembrandt's painting of his son, I burst into tears and I had to walk away. Why does that happen?" And I said, "Gee, Dick, I don't really know. But that's why it's in a museum. And that's why they call it fine art." And a light dawned in his eyes, and he was like, "Oh, that's what you've been talking about." And he said, "Is there more of that stuff?" And Bob says, "I made a mental fist pump. I had him hooked." And so we traveled to great museums of the world until he got too old to travel. He even came to appreciate the abstract expressionists. And we still had plenty to talk about because he, over the years, introduced me to great music. From the fanciest symphonies to medieval Gregorian chants to the big band era to the funkiest blues to the greatest gospel. Beyond the art and music, though, we never ran out of fun to talk about. Politics, science, history, exotic airplanes, the weather, great apples, books, the past, the future, barbecue, Chinese food, the latest medical breakthroughs. Dick mourned with me when my loved ones passed away. I mourned with him when his loved ones passed on. That's about as good as a friendship gets. Sleep well, my friend. I'd like to invite Maria Groshut-Black up now to share a couple memories of Dick. And again, if anybody else would like to share, you're welcome to just come along to the chairs here, and we'll have another 10 minutes or so after that if you'd like.
I'm certain that the majority of you in this room know Dick a lot better than I did. But Dick and Ann welcomed Nicole, the boys, and I right away when we came into this church. In fact, they welcomed the whole glom of us that arrived from a church that had no longer existed. And I'm pretty certain that they were in the forefront of bringing our church into the modern age of understanding and helping this church become an open and welcoming congregation, open and affirming congregation. From the time we began attending, From the time we started attending to just before we changed electronic systems, my memories of Dick are that he was always at the back on that old soundboard. And at the time, I didn't understand why. All I can tell you is that he made a point every Sunday after church to greet us, to ask about the boys, and like several other of you, promise that it would get better. Hang on. It really wasn't until after his daughter Karen passed away that I got to know him even better. I had been asked to help clear out some of Karen's things, and by extension, got attached to Dick. And he had called me and asked me to help sell his cars since he was no longer able to drive. He had two. And right now, and some of you have seen it before, one of those cars is still out in the parking lot. That's the little red Miata. That was the more difficult one, so I started with the easy car to sell, and I just went straight to a dealership and said, hey, what are you going to give us for this? And Dick's deal with me was moderately financial, and that was okay. They gave us enough that the amount that I would have received from it equals about the amount of that Miata. So rather than have a bunch of cash change hands, I simply asked him for title to the Miata, and he readily gave it. And I'll tell you this, Dick loved the Miata. I've never seen it until Karen, but I can imagine him driving up and down the hills. That is a fun little car. I can imagine in his younger stage, because at my size, it's a hard car. It is fun, but it's a hard car because it is low to the ground, hard to get in and out of. And I can only imagine that he used that car when he was much younger. He was a patient and kind man. I never knew him, and I'm sure he did, but I never knew him to really lose his temper or anything. From working with him on the cars, he then called me periodically to come do some things around his apartment for him. One of those was to assemble some furniture that he had purchased online. At this time, I did not know that Dick had been a professor, much less a PhD doctor. Okay, I had no idea. I just learned that not too long ago. He was very meticulous about how he wanted things done, and I'm not. I rip open the box. I grab whatever tool they send with the box, and I just start putting things together. Dick sat there and watched me for a little bit, and then finally, in a very soft but commanding voice, says, you know, I find that the directions help. I took it in the way it was intended, and I started reading the directions. And even still, I had a little problem with something that needed balance or more than two hands to assemble. And he waited and he watched me struggle for a little bit, and then finally he says, now if I was putting this together, I would probably flip it so that the base was on the bottom and you only had to hold. There it is. All right. Never a judgment in his voice, just always patient and quiet, and I would say parental guidance. And on that note, there is something about Dick, and he does not look like, he does not act like, did not act like. There was nothing about him that I can pin to, except that he always reminded me of my own father. He was very exacting in the way he wanted things. I was hanging up his clean laundry, and his closet was very organized. All the shirts had to hang. I think he was left-handed because they hung the same way I hang things. But all the shirts had to hang a certain way, and they were color-coded. And not only were they color-coded, they were shade-coded. And I had to rearrange things after I'd put some stuff up so that he had all of his blues, his greens, and the other colors together, and he could grab whichever color or shade he wanted in a heartbeat. You guys all know he was a professor, and I now know he was also a doctor. He was a professor of electronics and computer systems. And now I know why he stood back there all the time with the soundboard working on the electronics. It was a safe space to be. You could be over there and not in the of everybody. And it was something that he knew and something that he could give to the church when he was not necessarily able to give his time and energy other ways. He enjoyed telling stories, and most of his stories were about Karen and Kevin. Mostly Karen, because she's the one that I knew. I did not know her well, but she was someone I was fond of, and we always made time together whenever we were at a church function to talk. And when Dick moved into the place he was at, we made time to talk about him specifically. He told us stories about the kids and the things they went through with their kids that in many ways were similar to what we were going through. And to this day, I will thank him for showing me that I didn't fail as a parent. He didn't fail as a parent. And it does get better.
Thank you for sharing, Janet. I love that. Thank you.
When my first marriage fell apart, I never lost my faith in God, but I sure lost my faith in organized religion. Dick faced so many losses over the years, and he never wavered. He was who he was as a man of faith. When Anne passed away, and Kevin and Karen, and then Valerie Victor that he was so close to, I never even saw a drop in the level of his faith. He was the same. He could speak his mind. Before Dave and I got together, he would sit with Dick, almost right there, but the pews were still in place. And so he sat with Dick most every Sunday. And when it became known that Dave and I were together and everyone else was congratulating us, Dick leans over to Dave and said, "I always thought that one was high maintenance." Dave, to his credit, said, "I haven't found that to be true," which is perhaps why we're still together 10 years later. But he spoke his mind, but he also wasn't afraid to give compliments with the same gusto. And you knew if you got a compliment from Dick that it really meant something. At the end of my time as moderator, he gave me a very glowing and heartfelt compliment. I won't repeat what the words of that were because it's not about me getting accolades. It's about a moment that the two of us shared together. But that meant so much to me because, you know, he knew I was high maintenance and he still thought I did a good job. So I will miss him greatly, as will we all.
Well, I was going to tell the high maintenance story, but Janet beat me to it. But I remember another story that he told me when his son Kevin was sick and knew he was dying. He went out and bought a Suzuki Hayabusa, which is pretty much the fastest motorcycle built It'll go basically 200 miles an hour off the showroom floor. And he rode it for a little while, and he got too sick. And after he died, whoever held the loan called and said, "Hey, you owe money on this motorcycle." And Dick said, "I don't owe any money on this motorcycle. It was my son's. He died. Come and get it." So that was always Dick was quite a character. We'll miss him. It is hard to understand how much of a part of this church he was for so long, and that Miata was quite a car too, still is.
When I started here 8 years ago, Dick was the moderator, and Valerie Victor was the accompanist and pianist, and I was the choir director. And I got to have Valerie for about 2 weeks before she got sick. And Dick came to me in a panic and said, "Do you know any piano players? We have to get a piano player." I said, "Well, I do play," and he went, "Oh." And I went, "I've played at Carnegie Hall twice." He goes, oh, okay. Now, Valerie and I like the same arrangers. We both like Fred Buck. We both like Mark Hayes. I looked at her library after she went into the hospital, and it was a duplicate of my library. So I knew, and I heard what she liked to play. And so the first Sunday that I played, I saw Dick in the back, I thought he'd fallen asleep. And after the service, and the thing I played, His Eyes on the Sparrow, what I just played today. And after church, he said, "I loved your offertory." He said, "You slept through it." He goes, "No, I was closing my eyes, and it was Valerie playing." And that's the best compliment I could have gotten. And I will miss him. And I will miss our lunches together at Waterford Terrace. And I'll miss all the computer stuff that he gave me when he got new stuff. So, bon voyage, Dick.
Thank you for those who rounded that out a bit more as we remember him in this space. Anybody else before we shift towards closing? So I was able to be with Dick the day when he died that night in the hospital. And I had some time with him to myself and found myself just, he was not conscious at this point, but I found myself singing old classic church songs, because that's just what pastors do. We just do that, it just happens. And but of course, Amazing Grace came to mind and heart. And I hadn't realized that, Sheena told me later, very specifically, Amazing Grace is one of his favorite hymns, one of his favorite songs. So I invite us to stand as you are able for our closing song now, Amazing Grace, in your bulletins, screens, or 547 in our hymnals.
Saved a
like hard to fully capture the like tremendous sense of a fixture that Dick was in this congregation and in the lives of everybody who knew him. I think we've scratched the surface, but we will always remember and honor his legacy. It will show up in so many different ways, ones that are like very intentional, that are named, and ones that we simply will think, oh, right, that was good. So I offer these words now as a sort of formal commendation into the love of God. Into your hands, loving God, we commend your servant, Richard Hatch. Welcome him as a beloved child of light, son of your redeeming, and a soul transformed into love that never dies. Receive him into the arms of your mercy, into the blessed rest of everlasting peace, and into the company of the saints of light. Let your servant go forth in peace according to your word. Amen. You may be seated, you may be dismissed and released, holding Dick in memory always, now and forever. Amen.